So you met Sam Bankman-Fried through, interestingly, one of the people that you'd written about in one of your previous books.
Yes, the main character of Flash Boys, Brad Katsuyama, called me up in September of 2021. And I'd never heard of Sam Bankman-Fried or FTX, but he was my friend, was about to do a business deal with him. And he said it's the most peculiar situation, that this company he's created, FTX, is the fastest growing financial company I've ever seen. And nobody knows who Sam Bankman-Fried is. And he'd gone from like having no dollars 2 years before to being worth $22.5 billion when I met him, and he was the richest person in the world under 30. So my friend said, could you just tell me what you think of him? So I spent a couple hours with him. I actually told him, can't see any reason why you wouldn't do the deal. Yeah.
And what were your first impressions then?
Pretty quickly, like in those 2 hours, I thought it's literary material. That was my real first impression. And what interested me was, I'm always interested in where characters can take you. And it wasn't with him just crypto, and he had a really interesting view of crypto because he wasn't like a religionist. He sort of, this could all fall apart, this is all be nonsense. Right now it's a good way to make money. But he'd come through Jane Street, a high frequency trading firm, and I knew he would let me, if I wrote about it, it would let me get into that, which I've always wanted to do. And he had his fingerprints at that point. I mean, it's a giant pile of money, right? $22 billion. He was saying he was going to spend $1 billion in the next presidential campaign, and he was already spending a lot of money in American politics, so he would take you into American politics and to media and philanthropy. And so I just thought, like, he's a character we can travel with and see these systems. So that was kind of my first thing. As a person, he was peculiar. And he was peculiar because it took me a while to understand all this about him. But he had a very mathy approach to life. Like, every decision was a calculation, and he was calculating the expected value of various outcomes, right, like up to and including, does he get married and have children? And I just thought I've never quite seen that. It was like moneyballing life is what it felt like. So that was the other odd thing about him.
Did you feel that you had to know much about crypto to get into his world?
I had to learn some. I had made a couple of dry runs at writing about crypto. So I had gone and learned about crypto once back in 2012 and another time in like 2018. And both times abandoned the idea of writing about it. So it wasn't alien to me. But it had gotten so complicated. Like, originally there's just Bitcoin. By the time I meet Sam, there's several thousand different cryptocurrencies. The market value of these cryptocurrencies is $3 trillion, and it got much more complicated. So I felt the reader. I had to know more than the reader needed to know, but the reader really only needed to know what Sam needed to know. So they needed to learn some things, but it wasn't going to be a primer on crypto.
It's been suggested that he's unlike any of the other people that you've written about previously, because you tend to sort of home in on unsung heroes quite often, or people who emerge from the story in a heroic light. This guy's ended up in court and been charged with fraud.
Yeah, so I would dispute the characterization of my books as like I go looking for heroes. I mean, a lot of people didn't like the characters in The Big Short. I mean, those are people who were making a fortune off the collapse of the society. In other cases, it's just like the characters are more neutral. They all have one thing in common to me. When I think about what I want in a character, it isn't I want a hero or a villain or whatever. I want a teacher. I want someone who can, either through their experiences, but both, ideally, their situation, their experiences, and their actual ability to teach you, it's just off the charts. And he had that, and he still has that. It was different. I've never had a character arrested in the middle of my book, right? I mean, I was there when he's arrested. And so that was different. And at the time that happens, I had not written a word of the thing. I didn't start writing this until January. So I had kind of a full picture when I started to write. And the odd thing to me about this book is that, so I hadn't written anything, but I sort of laid out, or thought I laid out maybe the first half of the book. And his arrest and the subsequent revelations didn't require me to change all that much. It sort of shed light on the first half of the book. Like, there's a blow up in his hedge fund in 2018 where half the people think he's a crook and thinks he's stolen money, and it all of a sudden becomes a foreshadowing of like what happened. So it was like more like a piece falling into place for me. And the other odd thing is, like, one of the problems when you're following around a billionaire is following around a billionaire. If you've ever done it, it actually sounds more pleasant than it is. They're here one day, they're gone the next. They don't have time for you. They're all that. And while he did make time for me, he made a lot more time for me when he was under house arrest at his parents' home with an ankle bracelet on and an hour from my house. So it actually sort of facilitated the book.
It's been suggested by a number of reviewers that you're too sympathetic to him.
I don't know what that exactly means, because I have had lawyers say that the factual pattern in the book actually amplifies the prosecution's case. So what the book does do is draws him as a human being and accepts some of the things that people have trouble accepting if they don't know the situation. For example, that he was actually quite serious about being an effective altruist, that it wasn't just a front. And I think the other thing that people have trouble getting their minds around is they want to think of it as like, oh, just another Bernie Madoff. It's so much more interesting than another Bernie Madoff. Bernie Madoff didn't have a real business. It was a Ponzi scheme. The bizarre thing about Sam Bankman-Fried is this exchange he creates, FTX, is an actual gold mine. His problem isn't this business. His problem is he has this hedge fund, trading firm, private, on the side of it, that's doing squirrely things with the exchange. So it's just like, people are, they have trouble actually having their nose pressed up against the actual narrative, because it's so different from anything exactly that's happened before. This will pass. I mean, I don't think anybody who reads the book, like a normal person who hasn't like already decided that Sam Bankman-Fried is the greatest villain who ever walked the earth, is going to think this is like some wildly sympathetic portrait.
But you've been very, very careful throughout not to comment on whether you think he's either innocent or guilty.
There's a reason for that. I mean, there's a literary reason for that. Is the writer enjoys some relationship to the reader. And I love it when when there's a volatility in the reader's response. Like if you have a book group and the 8 of you read a book and you come at each other and you're shouting at each other about your disagreements about what this book means and what you think of it. And I thought that was likely going to happen with this story. People were going to have different interpretations of it. And since he was on trial, I thought, the reader's really the juror. Like, I'm going to put the reader in the position of a juror. Here's the story. Here's what happened. Bad and good. It's there. You decide what you think of this. And that it would screw it up if I came in and said, oh, I think this or I think that. What I don't do, however, is completely free him of any judgment. It's just not my judgment. I didn't want the authors. So his former employees who lost everything and who were, I mean, they're still unbelievably angry at him, and they can understand why he did what he did. Their judgments are in the book, and they're quite harsh.
You've kind of answered my next question, which is going to be, are you surprised at how many people have been prepared to testify against him, notably his former girlfriend, Caroline Ellison?
Well, that all happened so fast that not surprised. I mean, so was I surprised back in, January when they all turned themselves in and said, we'll join the prosecution? Your legal system doesn't actually permit this. It's interesting that the prosecutors in a case can't strike a plea deal with someone who's part of the crime and give them like no jail time in exchange for saying what the prosecutors want them to say. It creates an impossible climate for him. I mean, legally he's cooked. So was I surprised? If I were in that situation, I'd probably do the same thing. Do you want to go to jail for 20 years? No. And if the prosecutors say, if you get on the stand and say these things, you don't have to go to jail for 20 years? So no, I wasn't that surprised. If anything, I was a little surprised that the 3 principal colleagues who were kind of on the inside, I was surprised that one of them, Gary Wang, who's the CTO, hesitated as long as he did before walking out the door. He clearly thought about staying in the Bahamas and staying with Sam and trying to figure out the problems rather than fleeing. The other 2, everybody else fled. I mean, not just the people who were testifying, they were all terrified, hundreds of people fleeing the Bahamas and going back to their parents' basement. This, by the way, talk about what it makes it different between any other financial scandal. This is the only financial scandal I can think of where all the perpetrators ran back to their parents' home, because they're all 25 or 28 years old. They were all like back in their parents' basement the next day. Yeah. And I thought, the parents are funny characters. Like, of all of them, it's like, what have you been doing? It's like Ferris Bueller's Day Off. Anyway.
If Sam Bankman-Fried isn't the villain of this story, then who is?
Oh, I don't know. Who says he's not the villain of the story? I mean,
well, if he isn't, who is?
So it's a complicated story. And if you wanted to identify dark or light forces, I don't think there's a villain. I don't think there's a. It's not. Sam is the closest thing to the perpetrator of all of it, but there is an interesting character, and it's CZ, who is the founder and chairman of the largest crypto exchange called Binance. 5 times bigger than FTX was. And what's interesting about him is he's the one who creates Sam Bankman-Fried. Sam Bankman-Fried, nobody knows who he is. He's socially inept. He's in Asia. He wants to start this thing. And it's only because he's blessed by and later invested in by CZ, this larger force, that he gets off the ground. But when he gets off the ground, they become adversaries, and fierce adversaries. And it's CZ whose tweet starts to really precipitates the unraveling of the exchange. So he's in the role like Shiva, the creator and destroyer of worlds, and he's an interesting character in the story.
And of course, Sam Bankman-Fried tweeted him when he was arrested and said, "Okay, you won."
He did. He was like, well played, which is an odd thing to do. But Sam Bankman-Fried was poking a bear. He was trying to get CZ's licenses revoked in the place he has license, Dubai, which would have left him stateless. So I think that Sam kind of brought it on himself.
What's the next project for you? Have you decided yet?
This is going to sound strange. I only finished this mid-August. The publisher turned it around fast, and I haven't really had time to think about it. But I do think this: the trial is riveting to me because the prosecutor's witnesses, it maps really well onto the characters in the book. So I'm like watching my characters. It's almost like watching characters from a novel come to life or something. Quite likely I'll write something about it, and it might even be a little book.